Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Ask Andrew Show, Canada's first Facebook Live streaming family law question and answer show. My name is Andrew Feldstein, and I'm the managing partner of Greater Toronto Area family law firm, Feldstein Family Law Group. Both myself and the entire firm practice exclusively in family law in the province of Ontario. Today, our special guest is Toronto psychotherapist, Roxanne Derhodge. We are discussing how divorce affects children and other personal relationships. And without further ado, Roxanne, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure to have you today. Now, I know that you're a psychotherapist, and that leads to the question of what does that mean? What do you do as a psychotherapist?
As a psychotherapist, when we train, we're oftentimes trained to deal with individuals, and you can go on to further specialize with couples and families. So quite early into my career, I decided that working with couples and families was a specialty that I wanted, and entered into an extended program after grad school to be able to work a lot with couples and families.
Okay, and how did you get into that profession?
Well, I think originally I wanted to help people. I figured, I liked talking as a little child, getting the nickname of Chatterbox, and really found that talking was something I loved to do, and thought, oh, wow, I wanted to help people in some way. And at that point, kind of started to look into psychology in being able to help, but recognized that really in speaking to others, I had the ability to impact them in a way to maybe have them think. So explored the option of psychology, and then looked into becoming a psychotherapist and a psychologist when I entered U of T when I was 16 years old.
You said you help couples and families. How do you help couples and families as a psychotherapist?
Well, oftentimes what will happen is people will come forward with issues or concerns. With couples, it oftentimes may be that they're having differences in the relationship. Unfortunately, people might wait a bit late, hopefully not as late where they're actually getting separated. But oftentimes they're dealing with concerns. There's a lack of intimacy in the relationship. There's communication concerns. Maybe they're having differences around parenting or even blending families together if it's a second marriage, and they're coming forward to really kind of be heard and validated sometimes, and to come up with some solutions that they could potentially work towards to make things better between them.
Well, it's funny you say that. I remember one therapist once said to me, people take their car in every year for a tune-up, but they don't take their marriage in for a tune-up, and by the time they come to see a lot of therapists, it's frequently too late. And I don't know if that's part of what you're saying frequently happens.
Well, I think I would say that oftentimes it's been too late, but it's not that people don't make changes. So I see two types of couples. They wait too long, and they come and they either get woken up, or they've gotten into the element of disdain. And I think what we know about disdain is that it's oftentimes difficult to have people kind of start to really reflect on why they got together in the first place. So life gets in the way, families, raising children, long days, activities, the busyness of life. And what gets put on the back burner is the relationship. And people are running pretty good lives. And I think most people have pretty fulfilling lives. They're good in partnership, but the intimacy and the connectedness in the relationship often wanes.
Now, I also heard you talk about you help people with blended families. And if you read the literature, you can see that the divorce rate is higher with second relationships than it was with the first one. So what are the types of issues that you see with blended families?
Well, what happens is people have these idealistic expectations because they fall in love, right? So the first relationship doesn't end, and they get into the second relationship. And what happens is that they're not looking at the implications of blending both those families, being oftentimes most people have kids on both ends. So the conflict, they fall in love. And I often say that the couples want the kids to fall in love equally as quickly. Well, guess what? They are still oftentimes, the kids are reeling from the first marriage ending. And now they've got the second person becoming a parenting role in their lives. And there's different roles and responsibilities. So what's happening is what we suggest to couples is that you really should be, if you're thinking about it, getting into a second marriage, come in to speak to someone like us so that you could start to talk about the roles, the rules, the responsibilities, which is the business part of relationships, right? The emotional part may be in tow. You're going to be okay together, but what kind of things are the kids going to be going through?
And do you ever see situations where it's difficult for the second relationship because of problems from the first relationship?
Absolutely. And yes, what I think is that people think that they're not repeating the patterns all over again the second time. So what I say to people is, if you've been into a first relationship, slow down a bit, kind of try to figure out, what was my role? You know, it's nice to believe that you don't have a role and responsibility, and maybe you didn't, right? But at some point, you know, there's takes two to kind of tangle. And with when they kind of start to reflect on that, then they might look at not repeating the same patterns. And one thing that I want to kind of speak to is, you know, the individual therapy versus putting the family together. What we know with blended families is initially the couple should come in, but soon after the kids should be involved because they also have a voice, right? And they're going through a lot of grieving. They have a place, two homes oftentimes, different rules, different expectations. So initially we say to couples, if you're having trouble with your child, you should kind of start to look at yourself as a system and say what could be done differently with you collectively to assist this child through the situation.
Okay, now we did have a question on that came in, and the question dealt with the issue of the children are adjusting to the divorce differently, and should the children be attending counseling together or individually?
Well, initially what we suggest is that we meet the children individually, but we collectively get the family together. So like, let's say it's a 7-year-old and a 15-year-old, they're going to be different needs for the 15-year-old compared to the 7-year-old. So initially we might join and bond with each child, understand the perspectives and what their needs are of their parents. And then we put them all together collectively as a family to talk about, ideally, how is this family going to work when we're all getting along and, you know, trying to blend together, you know, to have a better life together.
Okay. Now, are most people aware of what can happen to their personal relationships during divorce and separation?
I would say yes and no. Sometimes people think that it's going to be a lot tougher. But again, it goes back to the initial parenting styles of these individuals. So I think you can look at two things. First of all, the person that's left is oftentimes a lot more disgruntled than the person that left. So we have to look at, you know, what are the implications for, you know, some of the concerns that are coming up, you know, just overall.
I know that a lot of times I see in my cases, and I've read this as well, that when one person is the one who decides to leave, they've already gotten over mourning the loss of the relationship and they've moved on. And the person who is being left just found out about it. And part of their frustration, their anger stems from the fact they haven't had a chance to mourn the loss of the relationship yet. And they really aren't ready to move on. Is that something you see as well?
Absolutely. And if it's, let's say it's a couple and they kind of emotionally draw apart and there's really no conflict, generally, other than, you know, we met when we were 18 and we've been together for 20 years and we've kind of found different paths, that's one thing. If it's one person that, say, has left ahead of the other, infidelity, you know, things like that, it becomes more tough on the person being left behind. So grieving that, okay, you're leaving me, you know, I failed at something here. What did I fail at? And as human beings, none of us want to feel like we failed at something. So oftentimes the person being left gets caught up at the end.
And how do you deal with getting that person ready to move forward with their life? Because I find that person is always more challenging to get them to a deal.
Well, I think, you know, I often say the first 2 years after separation is the most volatile, and that's when lawyers are involved, right? Would you agree with that? It's that people are tough. They're crying, they're screaming, they're yelling, they're, you know, talking about the lunch bag got forgot at this one house, and there's a lot of volatility back and forth. So I often say to people, you have to think, what is it that you want for your children 2 years from now? once you've signed that separation agreement, we know the laws in Canada, they're pretty much everything gets divided, and they once custody and access gets done. How is it that you want your child to function past this divorce? And we work with the individuals to try to think out of the rough, basically, and to think past the volatility of what's happening in the initial situation, to kind of think about how will you like your son to be acting in 2 years from now, because he would have coped well with the separation. So you try to kind of tap into the heart of the person being left, or even the person leaving. Sometimes the conflict takes two people to kind of think about how can they think through the separation agreement or situation, to think about their child and what the child needs from both of them.
Okay, and we also got another question that came in, and this has to do with alienation. And is a therapist helpful in assisting with my child who is living with my ex-husband, who I believe is alienating him? Absolutely.
This is something that you can come in and talk to. I guess I have a couple of questions for the caller. Like, do you have access? Is when the child is with you, what are you doing? Are you talking about what's going on? I often say that consistency is the best thing that you can do. Bringing down the other individual, not so much, because what happens is the child then feels like you're taking a side. Alienation, that said, is a tough thing. And if you don't have contact with the child, it's tougher. So I'm going to assume you have some kind of contact. So I often say to parents, be kind and gentle, think of your child's needs, and think about what you're going through, and try to separate those things out to try to understand what your child is experiencing on both ends. And with time, hopefully that will come about. So I don't know what the circumstance is with the caller.
Well, from a legal perspective, the challenge you're going to have is you can't take the child to a counselor on your own. So first of all, if you're alienated, you don't have the physical opportunity to do that. And if you are seeing the child and the relationship isn't very good, and you can see you're going down a path where your relationship is deteriorating, you still can't take the child on your own to see a counselor. You need your former spouse's consent to do it. And if they are truly alienating the child, well, then the former spouse is not going to want to go to a counselor, because they're not going to want anyone looking into their house and seeing what they're doing, whether they know it or not, because some people may do it without even realizing that they're alienating a child. So when you're in that situation, what you're really stuck with is having to retain a lawyer and going to court to get a court order to have a counselor appointed to deal with this issue. And you need to be careful to have a counselor who's familiar with alienation, or even if it's not alienation, but steps in that direction. You need to have a court order that is going to compel them to, in essence, be dragged along into the process. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to get the counselor, and you're not going to improve the situation. I don't know, Roxanne, from your perspective, would you agree with what I just said?
Absolutely, because if you're wanting to move the process along, and if it's really actual alienation where there's no contact and no ability to impact the child, you have to kind of do what you need to obviously get the courts involved. What I often say to parents, and I can think of one particular case, and all that individual wanted to do was to come and run down the other parent and talk about the alienation. So I often move that person away from that and say, what is it that you can do to take care of yourself, to be able to be as healthy as you can, so that you can go through this entire process properly. So sometimes it's just about, when people go through separations, what happens for them is, let's say they've been through things, maybe they went through a separation with their parents when they were young. What that does is it almost often takes them back to that time. And they're also dealing with their pain that they may not have resolved initially from what may have happened to them when they were younger. So that's what we do, is to really kind of have them separate out what's presently happening with them, and how some of the past may be impacting their inability to really stay focused about what's in the best interest of their child.
And from a legal involved in these kind of cases, I try to say to my clients, you got to be focused on the end game. The end game is improving your relationship. Yes, you will have to take them to court, but you need to do what's best for your child ultimately, and you have to hear what the counselor is saying and what the counselor is recommending, and move forward in that kind of direction. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to rescue that relationship. And hopefully, and this is something for parents to appreciate, do it quickly. Don't wait too long for the situation to deteriorate, because the worse it gets, the harder it is to fix.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When do you think divorcing parents should consider hiring a professional such as yourself?
Well, I think when they're having conflict all the time and potentially having conflicts in front of the children, where they're not able to kind of contain things or be able to deal effectively with conflict, I think at that point it may be worthwhile considering talking to someone, because if they've tried therapy, right, and the same issues keep persisting, and one person is maybe not trying as hard as the others, and you're seeing that, really one person mentally is out of it, the other person's not trying, those types of things. We often say we look for people willing to work really, really hard. Do you still care about the other person, and are you still seeing a life together? And progressively from there, we set goals based on what they're trying to achieve. But if the conflict is ongoing and they're not making any changes, and they're actually starting to see impact on their children, at that point we suggest that maybe they should start to talk, at least to investigate the possibilities of having separate lives.
Well, one of the things I regularly advise my clients when they come in at a first meeting, it's very early stages, and they tell me we haven't told the children yet. And I frequently will tell them that's a great time that they both should go speak to a counselor, because in the best world, both parents will jointly tell the children that they're splitting up. And I tell them, go get the advice from a counselor, because the message you give, like your last example of, I think it was a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old and a 15-year-old, how you may tell a 7-year-old and how you tell a 15-year-old may be a very different discussion. And is that the kind of work that you would do?
Absolutely. And I think what happens again is a lot of people get really progressively so embroiled that, one person doesn't want to tell the children, the other person wants to tell them. Ideally, regardless of what's happened, people should be able to put their differences aside. And I could tell you, unfortunately, that's not something that happens very often. I wish I could tell you in a perfect world that people get together, they think, well, you're leaving and I'm really hurt, so let's sit down and let's talk to our children together and talk about, regardless of what happens, that we'll love you forever and things will be okay. But unfortunately, it doesn't. Ideally, that's what's necessary. That's what the kids need to know. They need to know that the marriage is ending, but that the parents would love them regardless. It's not about them that they're separating. It's about the differences in the relationship. And that allows the child to basically feel a bit okay, even though they're going to still be in pain.
Now, we got another question that came in, and I think this is actually a really good question, because it deals with people's frustration and anger at the end of a marriage. And it's, how do you deal with the impact on children when marriage ends as a result of cheating?
Well, that's a good one, because unfortunately I see a lot of that. So unless the child already knows, so there's a couple of options, right? Sometimes the child does not know. If the child does not know, what we try to impart on the parents is don't tell the child. As much as you can. That's an adult issue. You can say, yes, there are differences, and dad and I or mom and I are not getting along. And sometimes adults have big problems, that the little ones have little problems, and they couldn't resolve it. Oftentimes, unfortunately, what happens is sometimes the children are exposed. They know about the affair or the affairee. At that point, if the child is asking questions, you have to say to them, look, there was differences. There was another person involved. However, that is something that, mom and dad are trying to work out together. That has nothing to do with you again. To, again, not have the child internalize the blame, because when the parents move on, the child still holds the hurt. Because a lot of kids, I can tell you, or even adults that come back to see me long after their parents have separated, have talked about, I always thought there was something about me, and my parents always never clarified for me that it was not about me. So I often wondered, was I too stressful, or did I take too much of my parents' time? Those types of things. So I think it's really, at the end of the day, not to tell the kids if there is an infidelity. If the child knows, try your best to quieten them and to let them know that this is not about them, and that their parents are trying to get adult help to get through this.
I've seen in my practice as well, as clients come in and their former spouse was the one who cheated, and they get upset because the former spouse is trying to bring that boyfriend or girlfriend into their lives. And I usually try to tell them it's not a good idea. A, it's probably too quick for the kids. And B, if you want to get to an agreement, it doesn't help smooth things over when you're throwing the new person in their face. And I'm not sure how you deal with that.
Well, absolutely. And we see that again all the time. The person that's had the affair now is moving in, or the child is spending, I had a couple of cases over Christmas where all of a sudden it's Christmas dinner. And guess what? They're now with the new person, with the new family, and the kids are spinning at best, where they're like, I'm not going, or I'm not going to leave my room. You can't make me, those types of things. So you're right. Absolutely. As best as people can, try to keep that time. If that's the person you want to be with, absolutely. But try to maintain as much normalcy to help your child through those traditions without that parents, as much as you can. So again, unfortunately, what happens is people aren't thinking straight through that situation. Their kids are getting involved. And then, we're seeing kids of divorce, unfortunately, a lot more that we need to.
Well, it is unfortunate, because I think of how many kids pay a price because of the divorce and the mistake parents make. But unfortunately, people like you and I, our jobs are centered around that, and we have to try and help fix it and limit the damage. But what would you say is the biggest mistake people make when it comes to maintaining positive relationships after a separation?
Using the child as a pawn, giving the child messages, telling the child about the separation agreement, telling about dad or mom is not paying for this, or that they don't love you because they're not abiding by the separation agreement. So I think don't tell them what's involved in the actual separation. Love your children. You may have fell out of love. If you both love, and most couples, they love their children. Try to keep that off radar. If your spouse is not speaking to you, go through the lawyers, unfortunately, as much as you need to, but don't go to the child, because that puts a child directly in the middle of the conflict.
And one of the things we see that's a problem is just something as simple as clothes, where one person's paying child support and they're upset because the payer of child support says, why isn't the other person buying a good winter jacket or buying clothes for my child? And then the child comes over and says, well, mommy or daddy says you're supposed to buy it for me.
Right.
And you can just see the anger. What am I supposed to do? My child needs a winter jacket. And they look to me for a legal answer. And the legal answer is, well, you don't have to buy it. But then they say to me, but my child doesn't have a winter jacket. So how do you deal with that kind of situation? Because that's fairly common.
Well, I think, again, unless you're financially strapped, I say to parents, is this really worth the fight? Buy the extra boots or buy the extra coats as much as you can. If you're financially strapped, then again, you're going to have to go back to the legal to get the money. But, I get the backpack got forgot at dad's, or it's at mom's, or they, drop them off 5 minutes after the defined time. Really, when you're embroiled in it, people are going to fight about anything just because they're still connected to each other. They've left, but they've connected. So go see someone. Talk to them about what you're feeling. Talk to them about your pain, what it's bringing up for you. I'm alone in the world after X, Y, many years, so that you don't put your pain onto your child as much as possible. So that's not, to me, find a good person to talk to. If you have a good support system, if you have good friends, if you have good family that could give you good concrete advice, absolutely surround yourself with those people. So that they can give you objective, not subjective information about divorce, really good practical information.
Okay, now I see we got another question came in, and it's, what is the best time to introduce a new partner to a child?
I would say give your child at least a year. Just let them get accustomed to that. They have a new bedroom, they have a new address, they now have two sets of homes and routines. Just give it time. And with time, introduce the person, if you know that person's going to stay in that child's life. And what we see again is, all of a sudden, the person gets introduced and the child gets, oh, we broke up. Now the child has gotten attached to somebody yet again that's not going to stay in their life. So I often say, if you know that person is with you a year after, and you know this person's going to stay in your child's life, give the child the gift of connection, which is, now I'm connected to mom or dad. They really love me, even though things didn't work, before you introduce that child to yet another, parenting figure in their life that may or may not stay. It's more confusion, which really leads to more pain.
And one of the questions I frequently get from clients is, I've introduced the children to a new partner, kids like the partner, but my ex is saying all sorts of horrible things about them. What do you tell somebody in that situation?
Don't say bad things about the partner as best as you can. You may think it, you may go, talk to your friends about it and your family. Do not say that about the child. Let the child figure it out. If that person is really a not nice person, right? Let the child figure it out with time. Children are very resilient. What people don't realize is that I will go in, I'll give you an example. I see couples or families, and I often go to the youngest child in the family because they give me the exact issues that are wrong in the family because they don't have the defenses. So if I go to the 5-year-old and then I go to the 15-year-old, by the time I've gotten to the 15-year-old, the 15-year-old is telling me what mom and dad wants them to say to me. The 5-year-old says, they fight all the time as soon as I go to bed. And because they're fighting about money and I can't go to hockey, that's what I've heard. So, so again, they're precious and they're resilient. So give them that space, even though your marriage hasn't worked out.
Now, I know you've written a book. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that book?
Sure. I wrote my book and it was launched in 2015. It's called A Therapist's Insider's Guide on Relationships. And you can order it on my website. It talks to people about what I did something kind of pretty gutsy as I analyzed my own life, because after 25 years of marriage, which I didn't share with you, I also separated. And so I took the time to analyze my own life and maybe some of the dips that I have made that I shouldn't have made, even though I was a psychotherapist. And I looked at a blueprint of all of my relationships and also my relationship with my ex. And what it does is it allows you to really look at your role and what you could do to make relationships better. And it's probably not a bad read for people separating or just wanting to enhance relationships that aren't going so well for them.
Okay, so you and I are both in the same boat. We're professionals in this industry and we're both divorced. So I understand what it's like in taking the introspection of looking at your own case through very different eyes when it's yourself. Do you have any social media tips for people going through divorce or separation, which is changing the topic a little bit?
Don't go on social media and talk about your business. Just keep it private. I know we have this whole issue. If you're in pain, don't put it on the social media. Go get a good support system. Use your resources accordingly. Get a good book, go for a walk with a friend. Figure out the things that you need to do for yourself to be able to heal past this pain, because it's like a death, really. So in taking responsibility, don't put it out there, unless it's something really constructive. Recognize that it's not good for you. It's not good for your kids, those types of things. So I would say stay clear of those things.
Well, I tell my clients what happens in social media is probably going to end up in a court one day. And if it's going to end up in a court, don't put something up in social media that you're going to regret. So much like you're saying, stay positive. And when it comes to the issue of new partners, also realize that if you're showing great pictures with your kids and your new partner, even if your ex isn't your friend on Facebook, they may hear about it. And that's something that may create a lot more conflict, because they're hearing from friends, oh, I saw that picture of your kids with such and such. And it's more avenues of aggravation. So I always say to people, there's two things. Number one, don't put things you're going to regret. So don't put the negative statements, because I'm going to use that to my advantage against you in court. And also be mindful. If you're the support payor and you're saying that you're not making a good living and you're struggling right now and times are tough, don't show all those vacation pictures that you're going to great places or showing those dinners. Like I think of one guy on my Facebook feed who tries to act like he's very wealthy. And if there's an expensive car, he tries to stand next to it and look like it's his car for pictures. Those kind of pictures are going to be used against you, because somebody's going to say, look, that's your car and you have that car and you can afford it. So you're making more money than you actually are telling me. So be very cognizant of that. And don't assume that Facebook is private, because if you have a few hundred friends, one of them is probably telling something to your ex. Almost certainly. And your ex will be able to see the posts. It will get back to them. And the worst case I've ever seen with social media is where someone was just totally going to town on their ex and the child was a Facebook friend. In that particular case, the court gave sole custody to the other spouse. Oh. And that was one of the factors in the decision of the court, was because how could you say all these horrible things about the former spouse that the child could read? So it's something you need to be mindful of. I mean, even as simple, I do a show like this. I'm a divorced father. I'm mindful that I assume that my children, even though they probably don't watch, may one day watch this episode. And I don't want them ever to hear me saying something negative about their mother. So I won't do it in social media. I wouldn't do it. So I think you got to be mindful of that wherever you go. I think we're coming up to the end of time. I wanted to thank you, Roxanne. It's been a very informative show, and it's been a pleasure having you today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and hope I've made a difference to people listening. Having been through it to myself and written and continue seeing couples, I say just try to be gentle and kind as you're going through it for your children's sake.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
bye.
Bye. I forgot. See, that's my bad. I forgot my conclusion. Thank you, Roxanne, on being on the show. Pleasure having you. The next Ask Andrew show is on March 9th, 2018 at 1 p.m. If you have any ideas that you'd like to submit for the next show, please send us an email at info@feldsteinfamilylaw.com.